You're listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. It's 11:01 Central Time, 12:01 Eastern Time. We now bring you the Quest for a Culture of Life in America with Steve Koob.
Hello, Radio Maria listeners. Welcome back to the Quest for a Culture of Life in America. It's always good to be with you. And it's so good to be back with Dr. Richard Lenar today. He was our guest last week on Radio Maria as the Quest for a Culture of Life in America. And he gave us a great introduction to the unique Ukrainian Mariology. It is the subject of his doctoral thesis, his doctorate in sacred theology, his dissertation. His deep knowledge of Ukrainian Mariology, coupled with his interest in world history and being a United States Army veteran, combined to make his presentations of particularly great interest during the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. And this past week, we've seen horrible things coming out of Ukraine, horrible treatment by the Russian soldiers against civilians, women, men, their husbands, shooting them, killing them, maybe children. I'm sure there's children that have been destroyed by these people, these Russian soldiers. I guess the picture that sticks in my mind so deeply is a picture of 4 naked Ukrainian women in a pile with their hands tied behind their back, dead, shot by the back of their head by a bullet, obviously. Probably, undoubtedly, they were raped. And so much of that is going on and has gone on apparently throughout this war, not only around Kyiv, the capital, but around Mariupol, down on the border with Russia, the community that's been totally destroyed, and they won't let the civilians out, even won't let the Red Cross let them bring them out and bring in medicine and food and water and stuff like that. They're just brutal. I suppose most wars, maybe all wars, have that component, and we don't maybe hear about it so much. I'm just wondering if Richard has any thoughts about the brutality of these Russian soldiers and whether it's typical of war. So, Richard, are you here again with us today?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. I'm glad to be with you here, Steve. Yeah, regarding the brutality of what's going on in the Ukraine right now, I think it is really, of course, it's a commonplace to say what's happening there is terrible. There's every evidence that the Russian military is deliberately targeting civilians. And we've seen this evidence in this suburb of Kiev over the weekend of this massacre in the suburb of Bucha there, as you described it. And it's likely that the same kind of thing has been going on in other parts of Ukraine as well. If you put this in historical context, Ukraine has experienced this kind of brutality before. I don't think there would be anything in their history that would compare to the military action of the Russian army of systematically destroying cities. Certainly they've had cities destroyed in the past. But if we go back to World War II, Ukraine was occupied by the Germans, by the Nazis for several years. Kiev fell to the Germans in 1941, in the fall of 1941. And there's a well-known site in Kiev called Babi Yar, where over the course of the war, probably, the estimates vary, we don't know the exact number, but there were probably over 100,000 people killed there by the German army, by the Nazis and the SS, the Special Operations Groups, the Einsatzgruppen as they're called. At first it was mainly Jews, probably over 50,000 Jews, but then many other ethnic groups as well. There was a similar scale of atrocities committed by the German army around Odessa and beginning about the same time and throughout the war. So we haven't seen that scale of killing of civilians yet. But, of course, the war's only been going on for a month, and Ukraine was under German occupation for parts of it for well over 2 years. If you go a little further back in Ukrainian history, there was a period in the late 17th century when Ukraine was fought over by a number of countries, Turkey, there's Russia, Poland, and the Cossack groups within Ukraine. The Ukrainians call a 30-year period in the second half of the 17th century, they call it the Rude. And basically their country was devastated during that period as well, and there were many civilian casualties. So unfortunately, what's happening there in the Ukraine is not new. As terrible as this war has been, and I don't want to minimize in any way the horrific things that are happening there, from a military perspective, the intensity of this war is several orders of magnitude less than what they experienced in the Ukraine in World War II. But the wars just, as wars go, a month isn't a long time, so what will the future hold? We don't know. But, Ukraine has experienced these invasions, throughout its history. I mentioned the Nazi invasion during World War II. Prior to that, they were invaded again by the Germans during World War I. I don't think that conflict was as devastating to the civilian population as what happened in World War II, but it was still a catastrophic event. The defeat of Russia in World War I, of course, led to the fall of the Tsar and the Russian Revolution. Shortly after World War I, with that Russian Revolution, there was a civil war in Russia. Ukraine briefly experienced independence, but Ukraine was one of the main battlegrounds of the Russian Civil War. That would be in the period about 1919, maybe 1920, and so maybe a little further forward, where again there was a lot of loss of life and destruction in the country. If you go back further in history, of course, the Crimea was invaded by the British and the French in the 1850s, the Crimean War. One of those forgotten wars, perhaps, that nobody really figured out what they were fighting about. But it was a war that led to a lot of loss of life on both sides, both for the Russians and the Ukrainian people there and for the British and the French. Ukraine was, to some extent, involved in Napoleon's invasion in 1812 of Russia. Most of the destruction under from Napoleon's army took place further north in what we would think of today as Belarusia, and then Russia proper, it went around Moscow and Borodino, Smolensk. If you go back even further into history, there was, as I mentioned, there was the Rhone during the war between Poland and Russia and Turkey fighting over Ukraine. That war led to Ukraine being partitioned between Poland and Russia. Part of the reason why they haven't been weren't an independent country for so many years. In the 13th century, Ukraine was invaded by the Mongols when you had the Mongol invasion from the east. Again, the country was overrun and destroyed. Kiev was significantly damaged during that time. So there's a long history of these military invasions. If you want to list them, you have the Mongols, and related to that is the Tartar invasions. Then you have the Poles. There was the Great Northern War in the early 18th century, which involved Sweden invading parts of Russia and Ukraine. You have Napoleon's invasion during the Napoleonic period. You have the Crimean War. You have World War I. World War II, the Russian Civil War. So there's been many armies that have tried to take over and occupy Ukraine. But what's interesting about all of them is that they're all gone. All those invasions ultimately failed. And if you put that in this perspective of what's happening there today, again, I think the level of brutality against the civilian population in its intensity, if not in the extent of it, is probably as worse as they've ever experienced over there. It'll probably only continue. I think the only reason it hasn't been worse is that the Russians don't simply have the kind of military resources the Germans had during World War II. I think they'd be killing a lot more civilians if they had a bigger army. Russia invaded Ukraine with upwards of 150, maybe 200,000 soldiers. The Germans had several million when they invaded Russia, so it was a much bigger operation during World War II. But that doesn't take away from the destruction that's happening there today. And, of course, modern weapons are much more destructive, particularly artillery is much more destructive, if you can imagine it, than what we had in World War II. It could take out larger areas much more quickly and more accurately. So in that sense, Ukrainians are experiencing something new in terms of just their suffering at the hands of modern technology and weaponry. But the idea of a foreign invader coming in and devastating their country, regrettably, is, not something that's new.
Well, they've just completely destroyed cities, and everything in the city, whether they're hospitals or churches or schools or homes. It doesn't seem to matter. I mean, they just level everything. Like the seaport city of Mariupol, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I'm not sure. It just satellite pictures just you don't see any buildings. They're just gone. And it's just sad. People are trying to live in that situation. The Russians are dragging them out of subways and out of basements and killing them. It's just brutal.
Yeah, if you go back, I mean, the only thing that would come close would be World War II in terms of destruction towards the cities. And if you look at the history of the war between Germany and Russia at that time, Kiev and Kharkiv were centers of major battles during World War II. In fact, more than one. I mean, we could talk about several enormous battles. When Kiev was first taken by the Germans in World War II in September, October of 1941, it was one of the largest battles at that time in military history. The Germans encircled hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers there, because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at that time. The Red Army, the Soviet Army, probably lost upwards of several 100,000 men, either in being killed or taken prisoner. It was just an enormous battle. But if you look back at the newsreels of that time, if you see the Germans entering Kiev or Kharkiv, or later on when the Red Army liberated these cities, they didn't suffer the level of devastation like what you're seeing today. If you look at the cities in southern Ukraine, like Mariupol, of course, which has just basically been flattened. I mean, it's just terrible what the Germans and Russians have done to that city. And the other cities along the coast there, that moving farther west towards Odessa, again, these places suffered damage, but I don't think the Germans ever systematically razed a whole city in Ukraine. There certainly would be examples of smaller towns and cities that were the centers of very significant fighting. And there would be parts of those cities, like Kiev and Kharkiv, that suffered damage during these enormous battles that took place in Ukraine during World War II. But I don't think the Germans ever deliberately tried to just destroy the entire civilian population. Certainly they had they committed acts that would, I think, count as genocide, and they wanted to exterminate Jews and enslave people. I mean, we don't want to minimize any of that. But I just don't feel that it had the intention like what the Russians are doing here, where it was just so deliberately directed towards civilian targets. I mean, the Russians have deliberately attacked schools, hospitals, maternity wards, that theater that they that they attacked and destroyed that had civilians sheltering in the basement in Mariupol. I don't think you see the German army doing those kind of things. I mean, the caveat would be that during World War II, weapons were much less accurate than they are now when you talk about bombing and artillery, so there would have been collateral damage. But the Germans, I think, were smart enough to realize that there's not a lot of military advantage in destroying a city. If you bomb a city and turn it into rubble, you just turn it into a better defensive position. That lesson was taught and realized over and over again during World War II. You see it everywhere. And the Germans certainly knew that. So although they certainly destroyed cities and things in the course of their invasion, I don't think they deliberately set out, at least in Ukraine, to level cities the way the Russians have. So that is something that's different. I think there's a level of brutality here that if it's even possible to imagine, exceeds what the Nazis did, during World War II.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's terrible, that's for sure, and I don't know, still see how it's going to end, and I don't know if you do either, but maybe we can switch gears a little bit here. It seems like Mary has been challenged for the entire history of Ukraine to help these people, and she hasn't left them, and they have not left her. They see her as the most pure, holy Mother of God. She's praised as their protector and venerated in their iconography. So I ask, how has she held her protector image? What has she done to earn that?
Well, the protector image really goes back to the beginning of Ukrainian history. Ukraine, as we think of it as an independent political state or entity, really came into existence in the year 988 when Prince Vladimir the Great, who was the leader of the area of Ukraine, it was called Kievan Rus at that time. The area around Ukraine and extending further north up to around Novgorod, which is now up in northern, Belarus, almost up to the Baltic Sea. But along that area, along the seaways there from Novgorod southeast towards Kiev was the area called Kievan Rus. And from the very beginning, the leaders of Ukraine, particularly Prince Vladimir the Great, but also his son Yaroslav the Wise, put Ukraine under Mary's protection. I talked about this last week, that they built churches and in her honor as a visible manifestation of their trust in her protection. And where that comes from is a devotion to Mary's protecting veil, what's called in the Slavic languages her pokrov. What she wears over her shoulders is she's commonly represented in the iconography. There was an apparition of Our Lady in about around the year 1000 in Constantinople, in the Basilica, the cathedral in downtown Constantinople, the Blachernae Cathedral, I believe it's called. And at the time, the city of Constantinople was besieged by a foreign army. And it didn't look very good for the city, and the people of the city had gathered in the church to pray. And as the story goes, Our Lady appeared in the upper reaches of the church up at the dome, and she spread her veil over the city, over the people, to protect them. And that particular military invasion was repelled shortly after that apparition occurred. Now, that particular image of Mary spreading her veil over the people became a devotion in the East. There's a feast associated with it called the Intercession of the Theotokos, which, depending on what calendar you use, occurs at either October 1st or 13th, I believe. That didn't become a big feast in most of the Eastern churches. Remember, that was before the Great Schism, so there was still Catholic churches at the time. But even after the schism, if you look at the Orthodox churches, that feast is celebrated, but it's not one of the most significant ones. However, when Christianity came to Ukraine, that particular feast really became very important. It really took off. And I think one of the reasons for that is with Ukrainians, and then with the Russians will be associated with this as well, they have a very strong sense of maternal pity when they see Mary. When they see an icon of Mary holding the Christ child, they're very much drawn into this ambience of Mary's maternal pity for her children, and they realize that they are completely dependent on her for everything. And the Pokrov devotion very much plays into that, is this idea of her being the protector of her children. And that image has persisted throughout Ukrainian history, and this awareness that they have of being under Mary's protection. You can see it in iconography. There are many icons that depict Mary above the Ukrainian people or groups of people spreading her pokrov over them. When I did my research in the Ukrainian Marian collection here at the Marian Library in Dayton, at the University of Dayton, I looked a lot at the writings of Ukrainian immigrants to the United States, the diaspora, and they constantly talk about Mary's pokrov and their devotion to her protection, and they're relying on her for protection. During World War II, there was an army that was formed in Ukraine, I think about in 1942, to fight not the Germans, the invaders, but to fight the Soviets, the Russian army, to liberate Ukraine from the Soviet Union. And that army was sworn into existence on the Feast of the Pokrov, the Feast of the Intercession of the Theotokos. And their official banner prominently displays an icon of Mary spreading her pokrov over the Ukrainian nation. So the Ukrainian army during World War II, this Ukrainian insurgent army that fought against the Red Army, fought under Mary's pokrov. In the Ukraine, that particular feast of the Intercession of the Theotokos is actually the most important liturgical feast after Christmas, Easter, and what they call the Dormition, or we call the Assumption. It's really a big feast, and in Ukraine, somewhere back around 2014 or so, the Ukrainian government actually made it an official national holiday. Not that it wasn't celebrated as a national holiday before that, but it was made official, and it is a holiday that has all the trappings of an ethnic celebration in terms of costumes and music and folklore, ethnic food, and so on, and family gatherings. So I don't think there's other countries that have quite the devotion to Mary and her pokrov that the Ukrainians do, and it's very much been fostered by their history of the long litany of suffering they've endured. If you go back to the formation of Ukraine in 988, there was a period of a century or so that they call the Golden Age, when Ukraine was formed and the first cities and churches to Mary, especially, were built. But it's a complex history. But within a couple centuries of that time, Ukraine began to break up, and then they suffered just this whole series of foreign invasions and occupations, so that from about the time of, the 13th century until 1991, other than a couple of very brief periods, just a few years, Ukraine was never an independent country. But in 1991, they did achieve independence, and I think Ukrainians see that realization of their hopes for independence as really being a sign of Mary's protection and continuing presence with them. I think that's a very visible reality for them.
Oh, that's a very interesting and long history that you are having in your memory, I assume, which is impressive. The Pokrov, this veil, I mean, obviously it's much bigger than a woman could wear. So it's kind of like a cloud that she spreads over the cathedral or over the city or over vast areas of land.
I'm sorry, Chief. Yes. I mean, it is like a shroud. I mean, if you look at the some of the icons that contain her Pokrov, it is a very large garment that you'll see spread over. You'll often see Mary pictured kind of like in the upper part of an icon, almost like she's ascended or floating in the air. And then her Pokrov or her veil is spread over a large gathering of people. So this is it's an artistic image, but in the way it is represented in the iconography and in art is very much this very large shroud or garment. And the idea is that you could literally depict in these icons individuals, especially it's not unusual to see soldiers, for instance, as well as regular civilians, ordinary townspeople, and so on, really standing underneath this shroud, this veil. A very visceral physical representation of Mary's protection. And this is something that's very unique to the Ukrainian devotion. I mean, it is present with the Russians as well. But I think the Ukrainians have internalized it to a lot greater extent just because of their terrible history. And it would be very interesting to know today how real this image is to the army that's fighting there now. I would suspect that this imagery is present. Icons are very much, when you talk about icons of her with her Pokrov, as well as the various types of icons where Mary is holding the Christ child, these icons have often been associated with military events in the past. I mean, I know it's Russian, although I'm sure there were Ukrainians there. If you read Tolstoy's War and Peace, for instance, the night before the Battle of Borodino between the Russian army, remember Ukraine was part of Russia in those days, the night before the Battle of Borodino, the Russian general, General Kutuzov, actually had a religious procession, which Tolstoy describes in War and Peace, and they paraded an icon Our Lady, the icon of Our Lady of Smolensk, which is one of the holiest icons in Russia. The whole Russian army, generals down to the lowliest soldiers, with all the clergy there, they were all kneeling down and praying to this icon the night before a battle. But to get specifically Ukraine, there's a monastery in Kiev that's very well known, the Pochayiv Monastery. It's one of the biggest monasteries in Ukraine. There are stories of Kiev being encircled by an invading army, and the monks have a procession where they parade and display icons of Our Lady, and Our Lady appears and the army is repelled. Again, these are legendary stories. There are other stories further back in history in the East of particularly during military sieges, of icons of Our Lady being displayed by monks or religious in a procession around the city, and some type of military invasion being repelled. So that connection between the military and Our Lady, I think, is very strong. I think it's very interesting that As we know, a week ago on Sunday, Pope Francis renewed the consecration of Russia and Ukraine to Our Lady's Immaculate Heart, one of the things Our Lady had asked for during the Fatima apparitions. And within just a few days of that reconsecration, we should say reconsecration because John Paul II did it too back in the 80s. But shortly after that reconsecration, of course, the Russians began to pull back from around Kiev and some of the other cities and reposition their army. And, of course, if you go back to a month ago, all the military experts were predicting that Kiev would fall that first weekend of the war. The war started on a Thursday, if you remember. Kiev was going to fall in 3 or 4 days, and Kiev didn't fall. And then when the Pope Francis does the reconsecration, the Russian army starts pulling back from Kiev. So I think, if you want to look for a connection with Fatima, I think that may be, something that we can see as being part of the legacy of Fatima, that this consecration of Ukraine to Our Lady's Immaculate Heart really, I think, plays into and amplifies this idea that she is a protector of Ukraine.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I was going to ask you about a Fatima connection, but I think you just covered it. But there was a supposed apparition in Ukraine, the village of Rishiv, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, back in 1987. And it was on the 1-year anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. And Mary apparently did not speak at all during this apparition. And who did she appear to? Is there some young people again as at Fatima or other?
Well, Hrushiv is a small village in western Ukraine, near the Polish border. I think it's near Lviv, the big city there in the west that the Russians have been attacking. But there was a young girl named Marina who was walking to school that morning of the 1-year anniversary of Chernobyl. I think it puts it in, I think, April of 1987. And she was walking past the village church, which was deserted. The Soviets would not allow that church to be opened. It was actually locked, chained shut. But Marina was walking to school, and she looked at the church, and she saw Our Lady holding the infant Jesus up in the belfry or the upper part of the church. And so when she got home that day, she told her mother about it, and her mother didn't believe her, of course, at first, but the apparition actually continued for about 3 weeks, and her mother did see it shortly thereafterwards. Our Lady did not speak during that apparition, so anything we have to say about that apparition, is just, speculation perhaps, but Our Lady's intended her apparitions are always pastoral. And I think if you were to summarize most of her apparitions, they could really have 2 aspects. One would be, I think the single word repent would pretty well summarize it. Certainly that was the message of Lourdes, Fatima, La Salette, but also providing encouragement to people that are suffering. Our Lady tends to appear to children in areas that are less well-off economically. That's not always true, but that is a pattern. So in appearing to Hrushiv 1 year after the Chernobyl disaster, I think there's some interesting connections you could draw there. One is she may be simply wanting to, show encouragement and support, her continuing presence with the Ukrainian people on the anniversary of what was really a terrible disaster for them, just added to the long list. It's worth pointing out about Hrushi that it had a history of Marian apparitions prior to 1987. There is a medieval apparition associated with the town and a spring of water that is part of the local folklore there. And then in 1914, apparently there were apparitions of Our Lady where she did appear to the people and tell them that they would have to endure another 80 years or up to 80 years of, persecution and oppression by the Russians. So she basically predicted the liberation of Ukraine in 1991 in that 1914 apparition. Again, these apparitions aren't documented and approved the way we think of the official ones in the West, like Lourdes and Fatima or Guadalupe and so on. But I think as a local tradition, these things are very important, so that the idea of Mary appearing at that time in that area would certainly be seen as a sign of her encouragement. Also, it occurred just a year before the celebration of the millennium, the 1,000-year anniversary of the coming of Ukraine to, the coming of Christianity to Ukraine. So,
so it has
go ahead, Steve.
a lot of connections that can be drawn from this apparition in 1987, and apparently you're telling us there are lots of apparitions in this little city or village of Hirsiv over the centuries, and I guess it's I don't know of any place in America that can claim that kind of history. There's been stories of apparitions that have fallen apart. Like there's one in New Jersey, another in Wisconsin, when I was growing up, that got a lot of attention, but were eventually determined to be not supernatural. So this is. I wanted to. Can we switch over a little bit to the liturgy of the Catholic, Ukrainian, and Orthodox rites that are recognized by the Latin Church, Rome Church, our Catholic Church, but they have some significant differences that use significant different characteristics, shall I say, that we don't have in our Novus Ordo or extraordinary form rites of the Latin Church. Can you describe those? And my question would be, are they something that would enrich the Latin Church if they were adopted in some ways?
Yeah, they do. The Ukrainian churches use a different form of the liturgy that we use in the Latin Rite. We tend in the West to think of the Catholic Church and associate it with the Novus Ordo Mass, or, as you mentioned, the extraordinary or tridentine form of the Mass, the Old Latin Mass. That is very much characteristic of the Western Rite that we're used to, say, in most of the United States. But there are a number, I think there are perhaps somewhere around a dozen or so other rites within the Catholic Church that each have their own forms of the liturgy. And there are two Ukrainian rites. These are called Eastern churches. They're also called Uniate churches, because these are churches, in the case of the Ukrainians at least, that returned to the Catholic Church some centuries after they were separated from Rome by the Great Schism of 1054, which led to the formation of the Orthodox churches in the East. In that year, there was a break, and the Eastern churches separated themselves from the authority of the Pope. in terms of doctrinal matters, sacraments, basic beliefs, they're basically the same as what we have in the Western Catholic Church. They haven't had some of the developments of doctrine that we've had, but that's another topic. But what's important for Ukrainians is because they experienced that separation from Rome during the Great Schism and used a form of the liturgy that originated in the East, that liturgy is very much part of their self-identity, their self-identification, if you will, of who they are both religiously but even as people and as individuals. And they use a form of the liturgy that's called St. John, the liturgy or divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which there's one basic form that's used throughout most of the year. There are some variations that are used during Lenten time now, the liturgy of St. Basil and the liturgy of the unsanctified gifts. But essentially it's one liturgy, and although it contains the same basic elements of our Western liturgy, there's a liturgy of the Word and there's a liturgy of the Eucharist. The prayers and the actual text of the liturgy is completely their own. It does the same things that our liturgy does throughout the liturgy, but they do it in their own way, and it very much reflects, first of all, the Eastern mystical deep reverence they have both for the Holy Trinity above all, but also for Our Lady. Our Lady is mentioned more frequently in this liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. There are laudatory or statements that praise her that we don't really have in in our liturgy. There's a famous line where she's called higher than the cherubim, more honorable than the seraphim. I think I got that right. Very laudatory phrases. There's also a very strong recognition of some of the early ecumenical councils, particularly Ephesus and Chalcedon. Ephesus, which was the council that affirmed that Mary was the mother of God and it was okay to call her that. And then Chalcedon is remembered above all for affirming the two natures in Christ and what that meant theologically, that he's fully God and fully man. I mean, we allude to those topics in our liturgy, but we don't get into under the hood too much into some of the theological detail. And there's a prayer in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. It's called the prayer of the Incarnation, and it really goes into some of the details of why Mary's the mother of God and what the two natures of Christ means, with a level of detail and reverence that really exceeds, what we have, say, in the Glory or the Creed or maybe some of the other prayers in our liturgy. And that really speaks, I think, to how important a place of both the early church councils have, but also Our Lady herself. And it's very much any affirmations about her. This affirmation of her being the mother of God is very much in a Christological context of affirming that Christ is God and man. So it's good theology in the sense that everything that is asserted about Mary is there to affirm something about Christ, just what we believe about Mariology in the West. It's not there just to exalt Mary, it's there to exalt Christ. And we exalt, one way we exalt Christ is by making affirmations about his mother. And I think they have a very strong appreciation for that in the East. And a consequence of that is because the Eastern devotion tends to be very mystic, and it's not scientific. It isn't like their theology, I should say, isn't like what we have in the West, where they we like to write theological treatises and make deductions. They don't do that in the East. They very much, the liturgy is the sole source for Mariology. And these things express the idea that Mary's the mother of God. She's all holy, she's all pure, and that explains everything we believe about her, and there should be no limit to the praise that's given to her. And I think that's a very unique and I think very wonderful aspect of their liturgy.
Well, it's interesting. You and I have both been to many Mariological Society of America annual meetings, right? And
Yes.
it's a common lamenting at these meetings of the lack of courses in seminaries on Mary. And, and now you're telling us, obviously, that our liturgy, it's not rich in Mariology, and perhaps that's because of the lack of teaching about Mary in the seminaries. So why is that? Do you have any thoughts on that? Why we seem to...
Well, I think there are several things going on there, Steve. I think in fairness to the seminaries, there are so many requirements from the Vatican and maybe from accrediting organizations of classes that priests have to take in training in so many areas that apparently it's hard to squeeze Mariology in. It's often just an elective. It isn't seen as being essential part of the other things that we would believe. And that's really an idea that I think is a little impoverished in a theological sense. Pope Benedict XVI has affirmed in writing that Mariology really intersects with Christology, studying Christ, ecclesiology, the church, soteriology, studying salvation, eschatology, the last things. So if you really want a full picture of all those teachings within the church, you really need Mary. You can't have the Savior and Jesus without his mother. But that idea has been lost, I think, in a lot of seminaries. I don't think it was always the case. But if we go back to Vatican II and the changes that were made with Vatican II to the liturgy and the way church is governed, role of the laity, the church trying to find a way to engage with the modern world, somehow with Vatican II, Mary sort of got swept into the background. I don't think that was the intention of the council. Certainly, there's a whole chapter on Our Lady in Lumen Gentium, for instance, chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium, which affirms in very beautiful terms what we believe about Mary and the Church and the Catholic Church. But in Mariology, we talk about a decade of silence, that for the first 10 years after Vatican II, Mary just sort of disappeared. And Paul VI, finally in the mid-70s, wrote an apostolic exhortation called Marialis Cultus on the right ordering of devotion and towards Mary, and tried to, if you will, give Marian devotion an injection, a shot to get it going again. But if you look at the history of church councils, it's not unusual for there to be controversy after them and for it to take decades for the full intent of that council to be implemented. Ratzinger, when he was Pope Benedict XVI, talked about reform of the reform, that it was time to reassess what happened after Vatican II and really recover what the council really intended. I think there are signs that's starting to happen. I was talking with my sister the other day. She grew up in the period and went to school before Vatican II. She talked about doing May crownings of Mary, which was a common practice in Catholic schools at that time. You don't see that so much anymore, but it is coming back. I mean, my own local parish in Indianapolis has done that now, brought it back. So I think Mary will come back. I think it's very unfortunate with the consternation and all the difficulties that occurred after Vatican II. That's a very complex subject to talk about. But I think that's the root of why Mary has disappeared. And I think we really need a recovery, especially among the church hierarchy, for an appreciation that Mary isn't just this, notion of the devotion to her is just simple piety or naive religiosity that isn't necessary. I think devotion to her is essential if you're going to have a full picture of who Christ is and what the Catholic Church really teaches, because Mary is there to affirm the Incarnation, that the Incarnation is a big deal. The Incarnation occurred through her. And that's something we need to recover in the Church, and I think it's something that we can learn from the Ukrainian liturgy. As I mentioned, they have a prayer that is specifically extolling the Incarnation and what it means theologically. I mean, we mention in our liturgy, we talk about Christ becoming a man and that, but we don't go into what it really means. In the West, it's almost like the Incarnation was just this hoop Jesus had to go through so that he could die for us. He had to be a man. He had to be God and man. But I think in the East, they see it as being much more than that. And if you read the Church Fathers, which, again, is something that has a lot of influence in the Eastern churches, the Church Fathers saw the Incarnation as being something much more than just a necessary step so Christ could die. It's the idea that God is injecting life into a dead world through the Incarnation. It's called Christus Victor in theology. That's a theme among some of the early patristic writers. And I think they have a good appreciation for that in the East, that the Incarnation is about more than just the Passion is. As important as Easter and the resurrection is, it's also about victory over death and renewal of the world. And Mary is the mechanism through which that happened. And I think there's a great appreciation for that in all the Eastern liturgies, but for the Ukrainians, and that's something that we could learn from.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Incarnation, God becoming man, reset the calendars. It changed from BC to AD, right? And the whole world accepts that importance of that event. Well, they accept it, except that now they have BCE, before the Christian era or something like that. And I don't know what they have there after the Christian era, or beginning of the Christian era. But so it's the greatest event in all of human history, God becoming man. And the Church doesn't give it any particular great, I mean, it's a feast day, or it's a important feast day, but it's not celebrated the same celebration as Christmas and Easter, for example. So it's disappointing to me personally that the Church doesn't recognize the importance of the Incarnation. I mean, even a lot of documents call Christmas the Incarnation. Well, that's just totally wrong. It's 9 months off. Incarnation, we celebrate on the 25th of March, 9 months before Easter. So anyway, our time is very close to being over, and we didn't get time to, we launched into the history before we said the Angelus, so we should at least say the Hail Mary at the close of this program. Richard, I so much appreciate you having been with us now for 2 weeks, and you're a great presenter, and your brain is full of wonderful information about so many things, so thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Steve. It's my pleasure to be here today.
I'll have to probably give you a vacation here for a month so we can come back together maybe and find out, talk about what happens a month from now. How's that?
That sounds good. There's certainly plenty more that we have to talk about. I know we didn't get through all the things we were considering for today, but I'd be happy to come back again, Steve. That'd be my pleasure.
Oh, be my pleasure, my honor. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. God bless you, Richard,
Amen.
And all of your family and friends and your work. And you all, you listeners, take care. Have a great week.
Thank you, and God bless you too, Steve.
Thank you. God bless you. Bye now.